realized that my ignorance about all of this had harmed my own child. I failed my own son. He was in the passion seat tapping his feet like this. He said, Dad, have you always felt like this? I said, what do you mean like this? He said, good, like I feel bad. You felt like this? I knew I had failed him. And he gave me a big hug and said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did that to you. Just tell me you're going to be okay. And I said, they tell me I'm going to be fine. I said, do me a favor, will you? I said, if you don't quit today, your mother and I won't quit. I'm not sure I believe that, but I told him that. And then he was sentenced to 7.5 to 15 years in state prison. I don't know how we all didn't pass out, to be honest. I don't know how I didn't pass out.
Today's episode, we're sitting down with former New Hampshire Supreme Court Justice John Broderick. After seeing the impact of mental health struggles in his own family, he's made it his mission to help young people and families recognize the warning signs and know they're not alone. Through Dartmouth's Health React campaign, he's reached tens of thousands of students and adults across New England, sparking conversations and breaking down stigma. He calls this work the most important and rewarding of his life. And today, he's here to share that journey with us. My name is Maya.
I'm Jake.
I was on the Supreme Court for 15 years. I was chief there my last 7. And then I was dean of the law school at UNH for a number of years. But the most important work of my whole life is what brings me to your podcast today.
Is the work about your son?
Mental health, which is driven by my own family journey. I'm a baby boomer, not you could guess that. And when my son was young, I had 2 sons, he was at age 13 afflicted with some form of mental illness. And my wife and I, being baby boomers and having grown up in a culture where no one ever talked about it, so we didn't know much. He was still doing well at school, and he kept it well hidden. He told me later he thought it was just him. He didn't know it had a name. He was a really good artist, and so he spent more and more time in his bedroom with the door closed drawing. And today I would describe it as withdrawing. Yeah. That's what he was doing. But we didn't see it for that. And we got to high school, he started smoking. Kept that well hidden, we didn't know that. And he had friends in high school, but not as many as his younger brother, who was 2 years behind him. And if you looked in the yearbook the year he graduated, you'd see his photographs with all the other graduates. But if you look through the yearbook at the candid shots, he wasn't in those. He was probably home drawing or wood drawing. And I didn't see it then, but I see it now. And he did well in school. He's one of the brightest people I've ever known, literally. He's the best white person I've ever met. And so his grades were never quite equal to his potential. He always tested very well. So he did this very well on the college board. He got into a good college in New York, and then off he went. And then we got those weekend phone calls. And they could hear it in his speech, slurring and slurring. It was shocking to me. I didn't know anything. And talked to him about it. He said, yeah, everyone drinks here. It's, not unusual. But it was unusual for him, and we didn't know that. And over time, we'd be on the campus, and his friends would seek us out and express their concern about his drinking. And he said, Dad, I don't know why they say that. I don't drink more than anybody else. I'm sure he did, but I couldn't prove it or prove it. He did okay there. I don't know how he ever got a degree. Now that I know what I know, I've been awed. I don't know how he ever did it. And he, again, tested extremely well. Got into a graduate school in Boston and came home, was living with us. And once he was home again, community of Boston 2 or 3 days a week, it was clear he was drinking pretty much every day. And trying to hide it, trying to disguise it, but he really couldn't. We talked to him about it. He just didn't want to talk about it.
Well, did it seem like he knew it was definitely a problem and he was lying about it? Or was he kind of denying in himself that it was even an issue?
He was denying it. He just was denying it. He couldn't see it. That was what was so stunning. And we could. And so he moved out for 6 months, finished his degree, got a master's degree. And then he got a job quickly, which wasn't surprising. Lasted 6 months, lost the job. My joke was a drinker. Next job took longer to get. He lost that and lost time. Eventually, we saw the alcohol counselors. And they said to us after we told them the story, they said, your son's an alcoholic, so that's what's going on here. And you better get him into treatment. It's pretty hard to get someone into treatment if they kids have a problem. So we kind of forced that. And looking back, that was probably foolish too. But so then he went to 4 different rehabs, different states. We're praying to get some insight. He came home from Florida where he had lost that. And when we were walking to the baggage claim, he said, Dad, I had a drink on the plane, but I don't have a drinking problem. And eventually we went back to them and said, what do we do? And up to that point, by the way, this is alarming in ways, and it's my own failing. No one ever said to us, do you think you could have a mental health problem? We never thought that. Now I would think that early along, but no one said it to me, no family member, no colleague. And so they said to us, you need to put your son out, literally out, on the street and hope he hits bottom. That's that old expression. And turns his life around, or you can let him stay in the house. He's going to die drinking in the house. Not tomorrow, next week, or next year, but he'd drink like he's drinking and have a long life. And we loved our son. We didn't want to lose him, and I was on the Supreme Court at the time. And we finally decided to put him out. It's the hardest thing we ever did. It was the worst thing we ever could have done. Until he was living in his car, sleeping at the shelter, eating at the soup kitchen, drinking. And finally, after 3 weeks and not wanting that phone call that no parent wants to get, we brought him home, and nothing had changed. He's still drinking. It just is me. And I'm sure he was scared to death we were going to put him out again. And he knew he couldn't go back out. So one night when he was drinking, he assaulted me. I had no memory of that, but I was in the ICU for 6 or 8 days. It's pretty serious. And my wife, my son was arrested, arraigned in a public courtroom in Manchester. I was in the ICU. My wife dealt with all that. I don't know how she did that. My wife's an amazing person, and my son is too. Anyway, he was sent to the Dollar Street jail in Manchester where he don't want to go. Trust me on that. My wife had visited him when I was in the ICU. He said, Mom, you can only come twice a week, but if you went to the street corner, I can see it from my cell. This is my master's educator son. If you went there, I can see that corner from my cell, and I at least know my family hadn't abandoned me. And so my wife by herself, it's late March, early April, would drive there, walk to the corner, and she didn't know if he was looking back. It's multiple stories high. So she said, I always gave him a thumbs up sign before I left. Then she'd drive home or back to the hospital. So I'd cry all the time. Eventually, I was taken to a room at the hospital. The first time I knew I was in the hospital. I said to the guy who was pushing me, what am I doing here? I had no memory of anything. He said, I think you fell, George. I accepted that because I had nothing else to go by. And after a couple of days in that hospital room, my wife and I were finally alone. Nurses and doctors. And I'd accepted that explanation. And my wife told me what had happened as best she knew. And she told me where my son was. And we just cried. I'd been in drugs my whole life by that point, and I couldn't even get out of bed, by the way. We just cried. I wasn't even thinking maybe this has been in the newspaper. It was in every newspaper. When I was in the ICU, my doctors went on the Today Show to talk about how I was doing. I didn't know any of that. And I say to people, I don't know what the dictionary definition is for hopelessness, but I know what it feels like. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't go home with my wife. I couldn't call my son. I would have. and I wasn't sleeping, as you might imagine. But the only good news out of all that is I grew to love nurses. Nurses are phenomenal. They're angels on earth. Used to be a nurse holding my hand. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning. She did the 11 to 7 shift, and she'd talk to me. And after a while, I felt guilty about taking her time. And I said, there must be something more important you could be doing. She said, I think this is pretty important. She was right, too. I never saw my son. They wouldn't let me visit him. The court would not let me visit him at Dallas. I would have. But my wife went, and then friends would give my wife a break. He was old, my son, to see his little. He's a great kid growing up. Anyway, the next time I saw him was 6 months later. He was taken to a windowless basement courtroom in Manchester to be sentenced to the state prison. Hope you don't have that day in your life. And he walked over to me, came in with a bailiff. He was in civilian clothing. I wouldn't see that again for a while. And I stood up and still on a press, was still a story to somebody. And he gave me a big hug and he said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did that to you. Just tell me you're going to be okay. And I said, they tell me I'm going to be fine. I said, do me a favor, will you? I said, if you don't quit today, your mother and I won't quit. I'm not sure I believe that, but I told him that. And then he was sentenced to 7.5 to 15 years in state prison. I don't know how we all didn't pass out, to be honest. I don't know how I didn't pass out. My son, he had served 6 months, so that meant he only had 7. Court suspended 4 of the 7, but he was leaving that day for at least 3 years in the state prison. And it's hard even now to imagine that day, but that was my life and his. And my wife, now that I know what she's endured, I had no idea. She's still alive, to be honest. She's an amazing person. After 30 days, I let you visit inmates, your inmates at the prison. And so we were allowed to go up. We met in this pure psychiatric unit there. My son was on house there, but that's where we met. It's very clinical, antiseptic, very sterile feeling, clicking heels on linoleum kind of place. We met in a large conference room with 2 social workers, the head psychiatrist. My son had to allow it. He was there. He looked great. He hadn't drinking in 7 months. And my wife and I, and he started out the meeting, the psychiatrist, by saying, I really like your son. I've come to know him the last 30 days. He's very funny. He's very smart, he said. I said, we love our son, but we're in the prison here, doctor. And he said, I know where we are. He said, let me tell you what's going on with your son. He said, your son has a really serious depression and panic attacks. I feel he was about to die, which the psychiatrist described as nearly off the charts. And he said to me, that's why he's thinking good. He was trying to deal with his mental health problems that he didn't understand. And he said it wasn't an illogical choice. It made him feel better for a while, but it's not a good choice because it's just a black hole. The more you drink, the more depressed, the more you drink. It's an endless hole. But he said now he's able to learn how to deal with his problems. And I thought it was hopeless, by the way. I thought all mental health problems, all substance problems were hopeless. I was wrong about that too. Anyway, I thought, God, not only is he an alcoholic, he has mental health problems. After 4 months, we visited twice a week, and I was on the Supreme Court, so you can imagine. My son's living with people, many of whom I upheld their sentences.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
I worried about it every day. And I said to him, look, if it gets bad here, you got to tell me that because I'll leave the court. I need another job. Dad, don't do that. You've worked too hard. If it gets really bad, I'll tell you, but please don't leave. I said, okay, but if you need me to, I will. He never asked me to. It's pretty brave about it. Anyway, he came out and hugged us. We go twice a week. That's all they allowed. We'd stay 3 hours. And then I said, how are you doing? And he said, Dad, I feel so different. I said, what do you mean? He said, I see a counselor, Dad. She's fabulous. And of course, he couldn't drink. He was in the prison. So I see a counselor, and she's great. And But the psychiatrist has prescribed some medication for me. I take it at night and in the morning. I didn't know I could feel like this. My mind's not racing all the way on. I can focus there. I'm teaching with the person now. And he was. It's right smart. And when he told us that in that place, I realized that my ignorance about all of this had harmed my own child. I'd failed my own son. I was a parent. I should have known something. He was like that. After 3 years, he was up for parole, and I said, I was Chief Justice. I said, you deserve to be paroled. I know that, but they won't do it. I'm the Chief Judge. I look really political. So I tried to get him to adjust to that reality, and they paroled him. And he's so good on parole. He's supposed to be on parole for years. The parole officer said to him, why are you on parole? He said, I didn't choose it. He said, I really love coming to talk to you. I really love talking. There's something wrong with that model. So I'm going to try to get your parole eliminated. So my son was excited. I said, and that first Thanksgiving when he was out, he had been home for 4 years. We're driving, he got some last minute item for Thanksgiving Day, and he was in the passenger seat tapping his seat like this. He said, Dad, have you always felt like this? I said, what do you mean like this? He said, good, like I feel, Dad. You felt like this? And I said, yeah, I probably have. And so I knew I had failed him. He said to me on that trip, by the way, he said, Dad, I didn't tell you this, but I was in the prison. They gave me an IQ test. I said, really? How'd you do on that? They said I was 2 points below genius. So I was kidding him. And I said, you couldn't be a genius? He said, Dad, my ankles were shackled. They were watching me through a two-way mirror. That's got to be worth 2 points. I said, okay, you're a genius. I don't know whether he is or not. He's smarter than his father. From the day my son left prison, he's not had a drop of alcohol. Not a drop of alcohol. He's religious on his medications. He doesn't like to talk about what happened because he said, Dad, I'm so ashamed that ever happened. He's a profoundly decent person. He said, Dad, you can leave me a liquor store overnight now. I don't need that anymore. I don't need the drink. I have a Coca-Cola like you would, Dad, but I don't need alcohol anymore. He used to drink every day.